afternoon, everyone. I'm Becks Heyhoe, the Executive Director of United End Homelessness, and I just want to say thank you for joining us for today's community chat. For anybody who's new, we do this event virtually about once a month, where we take a chance to do a bit of a deep dive into a subject connected to homelessness. The goal of which is that we can help raise community awareness, education, all around solutions for homelessness. We put up all of our videos on our YouTube channel. So we've got quite the library now from the last few years of doing these. So please feel free to peruse that library to see what subjects we have there. I am looking forward to today's conversation. It's very timely, as you'll see as we kind of dive into our topic. And today we're going to be talking about legal issues affecting homelessness. And probably many of you who are tuning in today are aware of the Supreme Court case that's coming up in a few months. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit today, as well as talking about some of the things that have been happening here in Orange County. And today I am delighted to be joined by Brooke Weitzman. Brooke and I met many years ago, right around the time when the court cases involving Judge David Carter around the Santa Ana riverbed were going on, and she's continued to be a tremendous advocate here in Orange County with her role as the executive director as the Elder Law and Disability Rights Center. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today. The legal side of an issue like homelessness can feel really complex and challenging, especially to somebody like me who is not a lawyer. And so I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, to lean into your expertise. And so really looking forward to our conversation today. Before we dive into that, for anybody who's tuning in who doesn't know you, I'd love for you to take a minute or two to just let us know a little bit about who you are and how you got into this role.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's always great to catch up with you. So I'm actually from the East Coast. I'm from New Jersey, and I grew up always knowing where I would get my next meal and where I would sleep, and always wondering how we as a community, as a society, could expect anyone who doesn't know where they're going to sleep today and where they're going to get their next meal to do really anything except survive. And so I was always interested in finding ways that I could contribute to creating that stability for everyone. I moved out here to California when UC Irvine opened that fancy new law school, and Erwin Chemerinsky had scholarships for everyone. And so I was in the third class at the new law school at UC Irvine. And by the time I finished law school, I had gotten to know the community out here. I've gotten familiar with the issues related to housing and homelessness here in Orange County. I had noticed that at that point, there still was not a single county or city-run shelter anywhere in the county. And so I decided to stay out here. I got my first job doing an Equal Justice Works fellowship where I did legal services for veterans. And that was a lot of eviction defense and really seeing the path that people went down when they struggled to make enough income to pay their rent, particularly for veterans, and trying to get them connected with VA benefits. And by the end of that fellowship, I really wanted to take a different approach that didn't seem to be happening here in Orange County. And so to do that, I co-founded the Elder Law and Disability Rights Center and went out to where the largest encampments in Orange County were and started asking people how lawyers could help them.
And you've been on quite a journey since then. So thank you for sharing some of your background and the why behind the work that you do. At the root of this topic that we're going to be diving into today is concern around criminalization of homelessness. And this has a really significant impact on people who are unhoused and across our communities. So as we start today, I would just love to hear from you. Why do you think it is that this type of response, a criminalization response, is so prevalent, even though we have data and stories that point to the fact that this doesn't move us in the right direction when it comes to effectively resolving homelessness?
Yeah, I think it's tough. Political decisions are not always driven by what's most cost effective or what's best for our community. They're often driven by political will or the appearance that those decisions will give, especially in an election season, as we're headed into an election season. Even our litigation back in 2018 and 2020, each time was often driven by choices that local governments made in the midst of an election season that targeted communities people didn't want to see. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to really solve problems, especially big problems like access to housing in the midst of a housing crisis in a place where housing costs astronomically more than most people make, especially people on a fixed income, like our fastest growing homeless population, senior women. And it does not take nearly as long or as much work to take steps to make the problem harder to see. And so criminalization of poverty in general, of homelessness in particular, have really been tactics that have been used back since we called them vagrancy laws. That when people don't want to see a problem, that one of the most quick and effective ways to make that problem less visible is to make that behavior unlawful. And then there's a reason for law enforcement to step in and arrest people and cycle folks in and out of jail. And that takes a lot of different appearances. So there's kind of what we often think of as kind of criminalization of poverty, making it a crime to camp outside, to be in public places like a park after dark. There's sometimes making it a crime to do things that are simply unavoidable behaviors. Every person needs to sleep, but sometimes we make it a crime to sleep outside. Every person needs to use the bathroom, and despite the fact that there is no necessary 24-hour public restroom in all of the cities and all of the counties in California, we make it a crime to go to the bathroom outside. In some places, it's a crime to eat outside or to leave trash, even if there's not a trash can. So there's those kind of slightly more creative targeting of unavoidable behaviors. And then as jurisdictions have kind of become a little more creative in their approaches, if this is a tactic they choose to take, I've seen people receive criminal charges for things like improper use of dairy equipment. Turns out that's possession of a milk cart in public. Dog off leash, dog on leash greater than 6 feet. Some cities have charges for being in a place where people are known to use drugs, not using drugs or possessing drugs, just being in a place where people are known to use drugs. And then of course there's kind of the simple ones that we don't even think of, like failure to register your bicycle. I suspect most of our viewers have bicycles, or at least some of them, and have never even considered registering them. And so things like registering your dog, registering your bicycle, registering your cat, those are all things that are required, and failure to do it is a infraction for which you can be ticketed and fined and targeted by law enforcement. And then kind of the last section is really crimes focused on substance use disorders. And kind of similar to housing and homelessness, we can see that those kind of mental health or substance use disorder related activities, there's an abundance of evidence at this point that targeting them with the criminal justice system doesn't help, that we need access to services and healthcare. But we still do spend a significant amount of time writing tickets for things like open containers or unlawful possession of illegal substances, rather than focusing that time and attention on developing the real solutions, on making sure that when a person is seeking treatment, there's a bed available, on making sure that when a person is seeking shelter, there's a bed available. So I think at the kind of core of your question, criminalization of poverty is so broad and encompasses everything from arresting folks for driving an unregistered vehicle simply because they couldn't afford registration, to driving without a license because they couldn't pay the license renewal fee, to camping or eating in public, to substance use disorders. And at its core, it really is driven, like so many things, by the kind of political wins.
Thank you. That was a really helpful sort of concise overview of so many different facets of how we see this interplay. I really appreciate you making that simple for me and everybody else to kind of to follow along. And I do want to just sort of highlight something that you said there around the sort of the difference between what could appear to be a quick fix by sort of making the problem less visible versus the in-depth kind of analysis and work that needs to happen to actually change and bring about like effective solutions to addressing homelessness. So I just want to kind of underscore that for everybody who's watching today or perhaps watching later on YouTube. It is the last day of February. It's a leap year. I'm sure everybody has already realized that. But for anybody who's watching, it's the 29th of February today. And in a couple of months, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a case that could have some pretty significant impacts across the country around cities, responses, reactions to people experiencing homelessness. For anybody who is tuning in, I would love it if you could sort of provide an overview of this case, help kind of give those of us who aren't lawyers the sort of the crib sheet on what is going on with this case. And I know that my team is going to be popping links into the chat box for people as well as you go.
Sure. And so there's kind of a long line of cases going back decades, starting in large part in LA, right near us here in Orange County, where courts looked at the Eighth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment, among other things, says you cannot engage in cruel and unusual punishment. And so lawyers started presenting to courts cases where jurisdictions, cities, or counties who did not have any available options to help people who were living in poverty and without houses were targeting them through these laws, the anti-camping, what they called anti-vagrancy, making simply surviving and existing outside unavoidable behaviors, things we all do, like eating and sleeping and going to the bathroom, crimes that people could not possibly avoid committing because they had nowhere else to go. And so these lawyers started presenting to the court the explanation saying, hey, when these behaviors are unavoidable, when every human needs to sleep, if you make it a crime to simply sleep, that is in itself cruel and unusual punishment. That punishing a completely unavoidable behavior cannot be permitted under our Constitution here in this country, that it protects us from that type of cruel and unusual punishment. So that line of cases went through a few different iterations. There was a case called Boise. There was a case called Grants Pass, which is the one headed to the Supreme Court now. But what they found over and over in these cases is that many of the judges, especially in California and in the Ninth Circuit, are kind of half of the country, would find repeatedly that, yes, when you criminalize unavoidable behavior that is cruel and unusual punishment, that there have to be available and appropriate alternatives that a person could take advantage of before a government could criminalize their behaviors. I would say at the same time that that's happening, more and more research came out that continues to show each time that even if there was an alternative, criminalizing is still not an effective way. Right? That folks, as a general rule, are not voluntarily unhoused or living in poverty. They're living in poverty because they simply can't afford life. And so figuring out how to provide adequate services, we see more and more evidence to support, and we've seen studies both here in Orange County and in LA that have almost all come to the same results, or everyone I've seen has come to the same result, which is it saves time and money to provide housing and services. But the question before the courts was simply limited to this: does it violate the Eighth Amendment when governments choose to criminalize these unavoidable behaviors? And so that question is now headed to the Supreme Court, where they will decide whether or not enforcing a generally applicable law that regulates camping on public property can constitute cruel and unusual punishment that would then be prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. And one of the things that it seems likely they will be focusing on is how those laws affect what they call voluntarily unhoused people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for kind of walking us through the history around that. For the Johnson versus Grants Pass, can you just share a little bit about how this is different than the Boise ruling? You know, that Boise was talked about a lot, particularly around the lawsuits that happened here in Orange County. Boise was referenced frequently. So would just love kind of your thoughts on how the Boise ruling and what's going to be happening. Where are they similar? Where are they different?
So I won't pretend to be able to guess what this particular Supreme Court can or would do. It's often a new surprise each time the decision comes out. But I think that the kind of range of things that these cases present are everything from is there a distinction between voluntary and involuntary homelessness to can you criminalize having blankets if you cannot criminalize sleeping outside? Now, of course, common sense says that even in a warm place like California, without blankets, you are far more likely to get, say, hypothermia or other really serious health conditions or even death from exposure to the elements, particularly if you already have chronic health conditions, as most unhoused people do. But certainly kind of the looking at the range of cases in this area that they have looked at issues from, are there times and places that people can be prohibited from being? Are there items people can be prohibited from having? Or is the question really, does anyone have an alternative, and is that alternative appropriate based on their personal needs?
Thank you. So I know I mentioned this, kind of when we first met was probably around 2018. And so for anybody who doesn't know you and doesn't know kind of your involvement and what was happening in Orange County at that time, could you share a little bit to provide kind of the Orange County piece and why this is connected and why we're having this conversation?
Sure. So in Orange County at that time, we had really two particularly large, what we would call encampments. There were thousands of people unhoused in the Santa Ana riverbed, and there were hundreds of people unhoused in downtown Santa Ana. And the county did not have it, was just opening its very first shelter. And for folks who are kind of new to this information, when I say shelter, you might be imagining like a building with walls or beds or rooms. Just to be clear, that's not what I mean. The thing they opened was a bus terminal with no walls and no protection from the elements other than kind of a plastic wrap around partial walls with some fencing and army cots. So for 65, 75, 85-year-olds, older adults with disabilities who could no longer afford their housing, they were expected to get in and out of these army cots. Initially, there was sections only for men and women, and eventually they added a section where couples could stay together. There were porta potties, not plumbing. And so, as you all can probably imagine, it was a kind of a degrading place to be. It was very high tension with hundreds of people stuffed into a bus terminal with no walls, a strict time by which you had to be in, and people would just sleep outside desperate to get in because despite the egregious conditions, it was the only choice. Since the litigation in Orange County started and the cities at that time, particularly cities near the Santa Ana riverbed, really had kind of developed this systemic turning human beings into ping pong balls, where every city would say, oh, you can't be here, but don't worry. We won't take you to jail for camping. You can go to the next city. And they would say, oh, you can go to the next city. And that really kind of de facto forced people out to the Santa Ana riverbed and to the Civic Center, which is how folks ended up in such large encampments. It was the law enforcement saying, hey, we won't bother you if you go to a place where we don't have to see you, where our residents won't complain because they won't see you in their space. And as those encampments grew, the political winds shifted and folks thought, oh, well, we want to relocate those people, but we don't actually want to take the necessary steps for housing. I'll say also at that time, as we started our litigation and started some accountability in a county that at that time had the perspective that people were choosing to be unhoused, that people were somehow choosing to live in poverty. There was not only almost no services and kind of a broad perspective that people didn't want help despite the fact that help wasn't being offered. But there was also the early stages of studies that were looking at Orange County and specifically finding how much more expensive it was to leave people outside than to look at solutions. And so as we started our litigation, initially we focused really on the property seizure. The county used to come out and seize and destroy people's property. And so we filed cases to force the county and later cities to stop seizing and destroying people's property, and eventually to stop them from displacing people without coming up with an alternative.
Thank you for the quick summary. Since then, how have things changed? I mean, this was catalytic. This was all over the news. This was making national news about what was happening in Orange County, California. And I think it caused a lot of people to wake up. And I think many people didn't realize that homelessness existed in Orange County. So in terms of progress since that case, I know not everything's been perfect, but a lot of things have changed. Could you speak to some of the things that have changed since then, Brooke?
Yeah, so I think we have in some ways seen everything change, and in other ways seen nothing change at all. And so certainly in terms of community education and knowledge, our county and our cities, the people who live here now have a much, in large part thanks to these sessions, right, and reports by United Way, have a much better understanding that homelessness is not a choice, that living in poverty can happen to anyone, that many people are one medical crisis away, that especially older adults who are just kind of flowing into homelessness, we call it the silver tsunami, that there is a fixed income and the cost of living, and they are outliving their savings. And so in the wake of our litigation, as cities started to open emergency shelters and cities started to really invest in what does outreach look like, what do solutions look like, how are we going to get ahead of this crisis, we saw a huge shift in the narrative. So we don't hear anymore, for the most part, in Orange County, they chose this, they should do better. Most of what we hear is, what do solutions look like, and how on earth will we pay for them? They're so expensive. And sometimes we forget that it's even more expensive to not do them. At the same time that we've seen many hundreds of new emergency shelter beds open and a shift in the narrative, we also have really seen the development of housing stall out. When we started this litigation, the county looked at the then number of unhoused people in the county. And at that time, it was only 2,700. And the county committed to developing that many permanent supportive housing units within 7 years. And the county thought that even though not all those folks needed that level of care, that would also be developing affordable at the same time, and that would keep up with the need. And within 7 years, we'd get ahead of this problem. And now we're, 7 years later, and we are nowhere near that goal. In fact, that goal has been dropped, the time limit has been extended, and the number of people dying on our streets has grown astronomically. And now we're probably looking at more like 8 or 10,000, depending on whether you look at the point in time count or the count by our Medicaid provider. But either way, there are more people living and dying on the streets today than there were then. And it's not because the county and the cities aren't doing things. Like I said, there's new shelters. It's because despite the front end things that are being done, we're not doing the real housing solution things at the pace we need to get ahead of this problem. And that allows the problem to continue to grow as more and more people fall into homelessness and poverty.
Thank you for sharing kind of and talking through. Yes, there has been tremendous momentum in terms of opening of shelter beds, and the way that Orange County looks at homelessness now in 2024 compared to 2018. You're right. We have come a long way, which is a really good thing. But absolutely, the work is not done, and the work is certainly not done when the cost of living in our community continues to rise astronomically. But wages don't, and we see more and more people who just cannot afford to remain housed here, of all ages. But as you mentioned, absolutely, seniors on fixed incomes are being priced out, and are definitely among the population that is growing the highest, for people experiencing homelessness. And so it is a real struggle. And I think in the worlds that I'm in, and we want to be able to celebrate and acknowledge the good that has happened and the changes that have happened, because we have come a long way. But as you say, the work is not done. And there's still a lot more that we need to do, and we need everybody in it together to keep moving this forward.
At its core, right, we have on any given night hundreds and hundreds of people who get to sleep in an emergency shelter now who couldn't have 5 or 6 years ago because we didn't have them. But we also have hundreds and hundreds of people who are desperately trying to get into an emergency shelter, because those who do get in languish there for sometimes years on end, waiting for the help they need to get into housing.
Yeah, it's org code. Ian DeJong from org code many years ago had done sort of a study looking at the flow out of shelter and how to create that flow so that your system could function well. And at the time, and this is a few years back, so I'm sure it probably needs to be updated, but at the time it was for every one shelter bed, there needed to be sort of 6 different opportunities for somebody to access permanent housing in order for that flow to keep happening. So 1 in 6. Or if I flipped that the wrong way. Anyway, it was a, now I'm doubting.
And we're still at a place where we have, even families with minor kids wait months before they can get into an emergency bed.
We've done, it's the housing on this end that we're doing a great job at getting people into the coordinated entry system. The shelters have come a long way in terms of availability and numbers of beds, but being able to have that access to permanent housing opportunities to truly resolve homelessness, we still struggle, especially as the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, as you stated, have been increasing year over year. I took us down a bit of a rabbit trail. We have 2 minutes left, but did you want to add something on there, Brooke?
I was just going to say we are starting to see more county programs to try and cut off the flow, which is also a critical component. We're starting to see more kind of rental assistance and support on the front end, because while we do have to figure out how to help keep the 10,000 people in our streets alive and get them back into housing, the more we can do to stop that number from growing, the less we need to develop.
Yes, thank you. The prevention, the diversion, those are pieces I agree that we're seeing more investments in, more people looking at. I certainly hear more cities talking about that. How do we help keep people housed? I have to pick a question, my last question for you here. So let's see. I would love, Brooke, I'm going to pick homelessness outreach court. If you could just share for people who are watching today, what is this? Because most people are probably not aware that we have something like this here.
Yeah, so Orange County has done a lot of work over the past year and a half and continues to develop right now to bring what we call homeless outreach court in line with the American Bar Association's standards on best practices. It's something San Diego was already doing. What we had before was really a diversion program where if a person had some of these types of charges for being unhoused and having those criminal convictions was going to be a barrier to housing, it was going to have fines and fees that they could never pay, that they could apply to enroll in this homeless outreach court. But to graduate, they had to find housing and employment and do a bunch of hours of community service when really what they needed to focus on was finding housing. And surviving the day. The shift that has been made is that Orange County now is really doing a provider-driven recognition model, where when a person is unhoused, and where they have minor criminal charges that are a barrier to getting them onto benefits, getting them employed, getting them housing, that they can enroll through their provider. So if they happen to enroll, whether it's in a shelter or in a substance use program or the county healthcare agency, that a provider can work with them to set attainable goals and to demonstrate that they can meet those goals, which will reduce the risk of them picking up a new ticket for the same type of thing. So if the person has tickets for trespassing on the railroads, the goal might be to get enrolled with a shelter or to get all their documents into the coordinated entry system so that they're on the list to have the potential to get housing. But this new kind of provider-driven model really shifts us from being a place where the court was dictating a one-size-fits-all model to allow diversion for unhoused people to remove barriers to housing, to a new model, which is a best practice model where our providers, the experts, the social workers who are working every day with these folks and who are better positioned to help set attainable goals for them, are setting realistic and attainable goals, and then taking that to the court and asking, hey, is this enough to resolve these charges? And can we dismiss these cases so this person can get enrolled in a housing opportunity I found them?
That's awesome. That shift wasn't on my radar until we were talking kind of in preparation for this. So thank you for sharing about that. That's something really positive. And I know we're at 12:31, and so I need to wrap us up. And we didn't get a chance to talk more about some of the good changes that have been happening around law enforcement. We did do some community chats on sort of some shifts that have been happening in law enforcement around how cities are choosing to respond to mental health crises. And so that is on our YouTube library. We talked to, if I'm remembering correctly, it was representatives from Anaheim and Huntington Beach about the shifts that they were making in their community, bringing Be Well in. So for anybody who's interested in that, hop over to YouTube to look for that video. Brooke, I want to say thank you so much. As I'm sure everybody could see, we could talk about these subjects for for a long time. And so thank you for being a part of today. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Thank you to those of you who sent in questions in advance. That always helps shape these conversations for us. This video will go up on YouTube. Give us 24, 48 hours to get it up there, but please feel free to spread the word to anybody that you think would be interested in hearing the conversation that Brooke and I had today. Brooke, any last word that you'd like to say while the poll pops up?
Just thanks for having me, and just encouraging everyone who does want to get involved in this to really take advantage of opportunities to increase your education and speak up when these issues come up. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the number one challenge we're facing in Real Solutions is political will. It's not funding, it's not knowing the answer, it's not the evidence, it's the willingness to do it. And so when you hear that there's a housing development in your neighborhood and your gut instinct is we need housing, but not on my street, think about what's driving you there and talk to your friends about why you really need housing even on your street.
Absolutely. And that is a wonderful plug for our Advocacy 101 class. If you heard what Brooke was talking about and thought, that sounds interesting, but what in the world does that look like? Where would I go? What does that mean? That would mean getting involved potentially with your local planning commission or your local city council. And we actually have a class on that to make that really easy and to help provide that information. And then we also do help people who are interested in doing that. We can help you with talking points. We can help you with figuring out how to write a letter, how to make a public comment. We want to make it easy for anybody who wants to be an advocate for long-term, proven, best practice solutions for homelessness. So thank you, everybody stuck with us for the last few minutes. Thank you for staying over. Thank you, Brooke, for staying over. And we will see you all soon for a future community chat. Thank you, everybody.